So somebody else, there's 172 churches that are doing this series right now in the Bay Area. Somebody else kind of put this together. And to be honest with you, I wish they'd left this one out. Because it's really hard to give a definitive answer, which is why Malcolm said I'm not going to answer the question, right? I'll let somebody else kind of answer the question. But what I'm going to start with is this. Let me just say this. If you're seeking, if you're wondering, okay, my goal isn't by the end of this, I've answered your question. All right? And on the other hand, let's just say the elephant in the room, right? It's like going into a stereo place and saying, should I buy a new stereo? You know what their answer is going to be. Well, of course, right? You're in a church. What am I going to say? No, there's not. Go home. Don't come back, right? But that's not my goal. My goal isn't to sell you something. My goal is to speak to that God craving that you heard on the video. What you cannot get around is that if you go through time, cultures, east, west, highly civilized, highly just basic, whatever it is, there is a God craving. Interesting enough, you would think in this day and age of science that religion is shrinking, but when they look ahead, there is a shift in religion, but actually the thing that shrinks is atheism, they believe, in the next 20 to 30 years. And I'm not saying that's proof that there's a God, but it's proof that there is a God craving within us. And I think a lot of us kind of inherently understood this. I hate to bring out traumatic experience, but on March 11th, 2020, the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 pandemic. And again, I don't want to bring up too much pain, but one of the key things that we learned in this process, when they went to protect the body, is that we are so much more than a body. What we unequivocally, across cultures again, across ethnicity, across the way you look at life, religious, non-religious, what we all found is this. We are also emotional creatures and mental creatures. And if you just treat the body and you don't treat the other thing, you will fail, period. Scientific. It's undisputable. But there's another thing that kind of arose out of this, which is stirring in many people, and that is there was a spiritual awakening as well. As people were faced with the knowledge that I am not just a body, I'm also an emotional, and there is something to my mental health, people began to say, I'm missing something spiritual as well. And again, I'm not presenting that as proof. I'm just saying you have to address the craving. You have to address it. In the 1600s, they were wrestling with this. There's a famous French mathematician, physicist, and inventor who wrote about this craving inside of all of us called Blaise Pascal. And he says this. He says, what else does this craving and this helplessness, just think of the video we just heard. What else does this craving, this helplessness proclaim but that there was once in mankind a true happiness, of which all that now remains is the empty print and trace. This mankind tries in vain. What we're doing now, we try in vain to fill with everything around them. That's what was Malcolm saying with all those pictures. However, this infinite abyss can be filled only with an infinite and immutable object, which is why all those four things don't fill it. In other words, by God himself. When we're talking about this thing that needs to be filled, this desire, we're talking about a God craving, or some might call it a God-shaped hole, a hole that only God could fill. And quite frankly, we're trying to put a square peg in a round hole. But only God can fill it. Now, one of the hurdles in the modern era to pursuing this God-shaped hole, this craving for God, is this kind of idea that to believe in God is like to believe in the Easter Bunny. Right? So I'm going to title this section, God and the Easter Bunny. Right? Religion really has no place in the modern world. And again, I already told you that they're doing studies, and that's not where the world is going, especially after COVID. But H.L. Mencken, an atheist and a renowned journalist in his time, his quote is putting it this way. He says, faith may be defined briefly as an illogical belief in the occurrence of the improbable. There's a definition for you. And then he goes on to say, a man full of faith is simply one who has lost, or they never had, the capacity for clear and realistic thought. He is not a mere ass. He is actually ill. Yeah, ouch is right. If you're a person of faith, like right in the heart, don't hold back any punches. And I think for a lot of people, that's the kind of the idea. Is it's like I said, it's like a fantasy creature, to believe in God. Now, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but that's a bunch of baloney. If you're a scientific person, it's a bunch of baloney. And the reason is that some of the most influential intellects are convinced in the existence of God. I could give you hundreds of examples throughout the years, especially the start of science, that was really created, the way it was created, the people who believed in God, that he made things in order. But one of the most highly recognized and revered scientists of the 20th century, Einstein, says this. He says, everyone who is seriously involved in the pursuit of science becomes convinced that a spirit is manifest in the laws of the universe. A spirit vastly superior to that of man, and one in the face of which with our modest powers we must feel humble. Now, full disclosure here, Einstein also said he did not believe in a personal God. So what most people think of God, Einstein did not buy into. But what he did buy into is he looked, this super intelligent person looked at the universe and what it was, and he said, there is something that this comes from, because there's way too much order. As a matter of fact, that's what drove his theories. Because his theory is that if someone designed it, then we should be able to figure out the laws that govern the design. That's what drove the science. And many scientists that preceded him, that was what drove them. They believed in a God. They believed that he created. And what drove them is if he created with order, he created it with purpose, which we talked about last week. Therefore, we should be able to study it and see it and come to those laws. I would not call Einstein an ass or an idiot. Another scientist, perhaps not quite so well known, is Francis Collins. He's currently, or he was, an American physician, a geneticist, who discovered the genes associated with a number of diseases, and he led the Human Genome Project. Not an idiot, okay? He was the director of the National Institute of Health in Bethesda, Maryland. And rather than me tell you what Francis says, let me let you tell you, and it's about 4 minutes long, tell you in his own words. Watch this.
In the home where I grew up, faith was not something that was talked about very much. My father was a professor of drama. My mother was a playwright. When I went to college and those discussions in the dorm late at night about religion began to occur, I found no reason to attach value to a faith worldview. I assumed that any religious feelings that anyone held must be on the basis of some emotional experience, and I didn't trust those, or on the basis of some childhood indoctrination, which I felt I was fortunate to have missed. In medical school, I loved the experience of learning about the human body and all of its complexities, and I particularly loved being introduced to genetics. But then I moved on to the clinical training portion, learning to take care of patients with real diseases. This was no longer an abstract study of molecules and organ systems. These were real people with real suffering. One afternoon, I was with one of my patients, a wonderful woman, much like a grandmother. She had very bad heart disease. She had a particularly bad episode of chest pain while I was with her. She got through it, and at the end of that explained to me how her faith in Jesus was the thing that helped her in that situation. She realized that the doctors around her weren't really able to give her that much help, but her faith was. And after she finished her own very personal description of that faith, she turned to me. I had been silent. She looked at me quizzically, and then she asked, "What do you believe, doctor?" I was stunned. I said I didn't really know. Her question had made me realize that as an atheist, I had arrived at an answer to the most important issue that we humans ever deal with. Is there a God? And I had arrived there without ever really looking at the evidence. I was supposed to be a scientist. If there's one thing scientists claim they do, is to arrive at conclusions based upon evidence. And I hadn't taken the trouble to do that. So I was determined to search for evidence. I was greatly assisted by a pastor who lived down the road, who tolerated my blasphemous questions, and gave me a copy of C.S. Lewis's wonderful book, Mere Christianity. Here was an Oxford scholar, a prodigiously developed intellect, who had traveled the same path. Within those pages, I realized for the first time that one can come to belief on a rational basis. In fact, I soon discovered that there are many pointers towards a creator that come from science itself. The universe had a beginning. It follows elegant mathematical laws. And it is fine-tuned by the way all those constants that determine the behavior of matter and energy seem to have been set just in a certain very precise range to make life possible. As I searched for more evidence of what God must be like, I encountered the person of Jesus Christ. I was amazed to discover how much we know about his life. I had thought that Christ was as much myth as history. As I studied more, I learned there is a great deal of evidence for his teachings, and even for his having risen literally from the dead. The evidence was compelling, and it demanded a decision. That day at my patient's bedside started a journey for me. A journey that I was reluctant to begin, but I felt I needed to. It was a journey that I thought would result in strengthening my atheism. But to my surprise, resulted in my conversion. I am now a follower of Jesus.
So again, I present that not to say, oh, emphatically, there's a God. I present that just so you know that you're not an idiot to believe there's a God. In fact, using your brain is encouraged when there is in the collection of 66 books in the Bible, one of the authors, John, who was a follower of Jesus, writes a bunch of stuff about his life. And at the end of that letter, he says this, in John 20, starting verse 30, he says, Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. In other words, there's many more. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is, Jesus being the translation of Yeshua, the Hebrew Yeshua, Joshua, means God saves, Christ being his title, not the last name, that's his title, which means anointed king. Believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing, you may have life in his name. You see, John wants us to believe that Yeshua is who he says he is, but he wants us to use our brain. Look at the evidence. He didn't want people to receive it blindly, but to look at the evidence. And the Bible itself is it's not one book. It's actually 66 books that's written by over 40 different authors over the span of 1,500 years. The writers come from every socioeconomic background, poverty to great wealth, and from nearly every walk of life, kings, paupers, statesmen, fishermen, poets, and physicians. But despite this time and the differences, the author's occupation, education, cultural style, and span of years that it took to write it, the Bible is extremely cohesive. There is a God, is its central thing. Now, there are many out there, like the atheist and journalist H.L. McKinnon, who claim that faith is misguided and that the only things worth believing are those things that you can see and measure. However, even that argument doesn't hold up in today's current world. Because no matter what you do, you need to choose your faith. Everyone is extending faith. Everyone at some point must come to place where they're choosing their faith. Choose your faith. Now, I don't know anybody who was here when humanity came into existence, right? None of us were here. Well, the best thing that we can do is kind of go ahead and go to the next slide. The best thing we can do is kind of come to a conclusion based on what we kind of see. But nobody was here. We got theories. We have a little bit of evidence, but we're trying to extrapolate it. Now, there's a scientist who served 14 years as ABC News' science editor named Michael Golan. And in his book, Believing is Seeing, by the way, that reference is in your notes, he points this out, that there's right now a whole world full of cutting-edge science in regards to dark matter and dark energy. Now, we don't know what it is because it is unseen. We don't even know if it really exists, but scientists believe that it does, and they also believe that it constitutes, check this out, 95% of the universe. It's cutting-edge science. So scientists now believe that 90% of the universe is invisible to us. Now, there is a certain amount of faith exercise to spend an entire life of study, not to mention the billions of dollars that we're spending to study something that's invisible and to this point unprovable. But that's where science is leading us. So the bottom line question is really not, are you going to have faith, but where are you going to have faith? So with those two principles, I want to return then to the question of our God craving. And maybe allude a little bit to this, what I'm calling the sixth sense, right? You're familiar with, right? The sixth sense is a power of perception seemingly independent of the five senses. It's a keen intuition. And humanity seems to have a sixth sense that there's something more, that there is a divine creator. And sometimes you can find yourself grappling with this question in a way that you didn't expect for reasons that you don't anticipate. For instance, for some of you, God seemed real at one point in your life, perhaps. But someone or something came along and it devastated you. And now God feels like a distant relative living on the other side of the planet. Everything's seen through that filter. Or maybe you've been part of a religious organization and you got burned by a friend or a small group or a staff member. And it's like, if that's what God's people are like, I'd rather have nothing to do with them. And that's the lens you look at it through. Or maybe every version of God's people that you've seen on display, especially in the media, seems narrow-minded, petty, arrogant. And you don't want nothing to do with that. Now, those are very real experiences, and they do need to be dealt with, but they really don't, they're really not relevant in terms of whether there's a God or not. Right? If somebody came to you and says, your house is burning down, you may care whether or not it's someone you can trust, right? But it's a secondary to question whether or not your house is really on fire. And you don't stop because, hey, you know what? I know this person's an idiot, so I'm not even going to go look. No, you're going to go look if your house is burning down. And the question on whether or not there's a God is one of those questions that we need to get beyond those filters and really look at. As the Apostle Paul points out in his letter to the Romans, he says this. He says, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, his divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. In other words, even Paul's saying that all of humanity can just look at the order. It is just amazing that when we get an injury or something, of how the body heals itself. And as amazing as science is about what we know, what's still amazing is all the things that work that we have no clue about, like the brain or the eye. Let me kind of put it, this is an oversimplification, but let me use this illustration. It's like treble and bass. At least this is what I've been told. Okay? You can correct me if I'm wrong, Corey. Right? In music, there's a note. I got the picture here. The top note here is the treble. The lower note is the bass. And I only know that because somebody told me that. I have no clue. It looks just like squiggly lines to me. But in music, there's a treble, which tones are high frequency. The symbol on the top of the music chart is that symbol. It's the counterpart to that is the one the lower, right, is the bass. Now, treble is usually something that you hear, but often the bass is something that you feel. So if you've ever been in a concert or quite frankly, you just drive by a young teenage boy's car, you feel the bass. You hear the treble, but you feel the bass. And the truth is, in our culture, we're surrounded by a lot of treble. Social media, sound bites, home pages, news feeds, advertising, entertainment, things that are fighting for attention, those things on Malcolm's list, right? But amidst the sea of noise, I think a lot of us deep down long for the bass note, or we know there's something to it, that we can't quite put our hand on it because why? Of all the noise. So again, let me say that this series isn't about trying to convince you, because I do think it's a sixth sense. I do think that we're talking about something spiritual, something other, a part of us that we're not tapped into. As a matter of fact, we're not encouraged to tap into it. We are encouraged to drown it out. Why? So you can consume more other stuff and make other people rich who are also trying to drown out their deep, long feeling. So what I would invite you to do is to just think about it. So I want to introduce you to Pascal's wager. Now, remember Blaise Pascal? I talked about him. He's the 7th century mathematician who was one of the greatest intellects in the history of Western civilization. You can look him up. But he also had a passion to help others find their way back to God. And so he himself began to challenge his fellow intellectuals to wager on God. And I don't think you have to be an intellectual for this. He would dare them to step into belief about God and see if it didn't change their lives. So he explained this wager this way. Here's the quote. He said, "Make a bet that there is a God who loves you. If you're right, you have everything to gain. If you are wrong, you have nothing to lose. Really, you have nothing to lose. Make a bet that God is real." That was his challenge. Just try it. Right? There's a saying in the recovery program that says, "Fake it till you make it." Because here's the thing, when in the beginning of recovery, whatever it may be, drugs, alcohol, whatever, you're taking steps, but it doesn't feel good. As a matter of fact, when you initially get off that stuff, you feel worse than you did when you were on it. But you know in your brain, if I don't get off this thing, life is done. And so in the meetings, they say, fake it till you make it. Act like it's going to work. One step at a time. And lo and behold, they begin to trust a higher power, and lo and behold, their lives do begin to change. What do you have to lose? So I would challenge you to pray a simple prayer. God, if you are real, reveal yourself to me. God, if you are real, reveal yourself to me. Now, before you pray this, I got to give you a disclaimer, full disclosure, okay? If there is a God, and I'm not talking about the demigod, all our heroes today are very fallible, very human. They're made in our image. I'm talking about the actual creator of the universe, who knows it all, can do it all. If there's a God, if he reveals himself to you, you cannot approach him as if it's his job to make your life work. If there's a God, you all of a sudden realize, oh, he's alive, he's real. There's also a duty on your part then to submit yourself to him. And I would actually put forward that there's a lot of people who don't believe in God because that's the issue. If there is, there's a requirement. And by the way, I say that because this room is filled with people who felt that way for a long time. Until we hit our bottom. And we're like, okay, my way's not working. God, if you are real, reveal yourself to me. And I'll end with this quote from Jesus on the matter. In Matthew 7, Jesus says this, Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives. He who seeks finds. And to him who knocks, the door will be open. That was Paul's message on Mars Hill. He said, man, there is a God who created all the stuff, and he wants to be known, and he's not that far.